So I would like to start with a story. This comes from a paper that's discussed in a book called The Indigenous Paleolithic by F.C. Steeves. It just came out this year. And it's from a paper authored by the staff of the Cultural Resources Protection Program, Department of Natural Resources, and Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation out on the west coast there. The paper discusses oral traditions, a pictograph, and a dance that are based on this story, or that come from or related to this story. In the paper they talk about, this is what they say: according to tribal elders, this story was handed down from the great god Coyote directly to an old chieftain, whose wisdom was beyond any other members of the tribe, and who had the good of man in his heart. The story relates the happiness of the Cayuse people in the land along the Umatilla. Then there was plenty to eat: venison, wild berries, salmon, birds, and roots. One day, as the hunters were tracking game, they saw all the animals fleeing to the south in great fright. The earth beneath them began to tremble, and trees began to fall. Then vast shapes came into view. These great things were waving snake-like shapes in front of them, and making terrible trumpeting sounds as they crashed through the forest. The strange creatures tore huge trees from the canyon tops and hurled them into the valley below. The warriors were brave, but as the creatures came closer, they fled in panic to higher ground. The creatures took possession of the land and plunged into the Umatilla River. They tossed water high in the air and churned the current into mud until the frightened salmon threw themselves on the banks to die or were trampled beneath their great feet. The Cayuse fled to the river of the north, perhaps what we know today as the Columbia River, and spread the news of the strange demons that had turned the Umatilla River into a sluggish creek of mud and destroyed the land. The salmon were dead, the deer scattered, berries and roots had been uprooted and eaten by these creatures. Coyote had been watching from his high mountain top and had seen the beasts coming from the north to wreak havoc on the Umatilla River. He knew they had been sent by an evil spirit to harass the Cayuse. He came to the aid of his children and confronted the elephant herd, demanding that they leave the land of the Cayuse. In fear of Coyote's power, the herd obeyed and returned to the north. The salmon soon returned to the river, the land healed, and the people were content and fed again. And the story continues on, but that's the part I wanted to share with you, and to also then go on to say, as this paper does, that to this day there's a name in the local Sahaptin dialect, which means big furry monster. And there's an old song and dance that is known among the people there that coincides with the big hairy monster. It's a shape that, a dance that's about dealing with these creatures, these big hairy creatures. And it is also very important to note that in conjunction with this story, there is a site on the Umatilla Indian Reservation known as the Mammoth Site, where mammoth teeth were uncovered during the construction of a modern-day golf course. Accounts of these kind of animals are found throughout different oral traditions here on Turtle Island in native North America, because people were living with mammoths. People were living with these large animals that went extinct about 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, the Ice Ages came to, could say to an end, but it reached a warming place that we are at now, an era where we're in a warming temperature. And around that same time, many of the great megafauna, the large animals, went extinct as well. Western archaeology has it, as you've already listened to or read, that native people came to this land somewhere around 12,000 years ago. That's been the story, that the Clovis people, as they were called, came here and killed off all the large animals who were here. But that doesn't seem to be a very accurate story, more based on the political mythology of colonialism than on actual archaeological evidence, as you've heard about so far with the other material you've had to read for this class, or listen to for this class. There are numerous sites out there, as Steeves talks about in her Indigenous Paleolithic book, The Indigenous Paleolithic of the Western Hemisphere, that go back beyond 20,000 years and even further. So very fascinating piece of history that has kind of been shoved aside and forgotten about. So I'd like to take a little bit of a look at what was kind of happening in the 10,000 years before 10,000 years ago, so like 20,000 years ago, possibly 30, 40,000, and some people are even pushing it back over 100,000 years ago, that it's possible native people were here in the Western Hemisphere. Part of understanding this is also understanding understanding how the glaciers work, because I don't know if you're like me, but I know I've wanted to know for so long. All you hear is there was the Ice Age and then there wasn't 10,000 years ago. What happened in all that intervening time? How long did this Ice Age last on Turtle Island? How far does this go back? And in her book, she puts it all together into a nice table. And really what you find out is that if people were coming across what is known as the Bering Land Bridge, which today would connect Russia and Alaska, and keeping in mind, this isn't the only route into the Americas. You know, there's sea voyaging and there's all those sort of ways to come to. And maybe we'll talk about that in class sometime, we'll see. But right now, with the Bering Land area, it wasn't only open, you know, starting about 16,000 years ago, when it started opening up and ice started melting up there. It's been open periodically throughout the last glaciation at various times. I think the most important and telling time is from about 45,000 years ago to 180,000 years ago, that Bering Land area was open. And modern humans, according to anthropology, humans just like you and I, have been around for at least 200,000, if not 300,000 years. And they keep pushing that date back ever older. You know, we have been around here for longer and longer as they find more and more sites and older sites. So it seems perfectly plausible that there were people that could be crossing anywhere between 45,000 years ago to 180 years ago from the Eastern Hemisphere here to the Western Hemisphere, to Turtle Island in the Western Hemisphere. Mammals, as Steeves points out in her book, were crossing, going back and forth between the Eastern and Western Hemisphere for millions of years. So anyway, mammals have been crossing back and forth using that Bering Land area to get from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere, and from the Western to the Eastern. And I wanted to kind of take a look through that at some of those animals that were there. So we have the mammoths, of course, that we were talking about. There were, different ones. Let me find my notes here. Rhinos over the last couple of million years. Camels, horses, of course, are thought to have originated here in Turtle Island. There are some stories you can find out there too where people talk about saying it wasn't the Spanish who reintroduced the horse. Some tribes up in Canada, like the Ojibwe, are saying there is something known as the Ojibwe pony, I believe it is. I'll have to look that name up specifically again. And they say they've always been here, that they were here before the Europeans came. There were giant beavers, possibly dire wolves. Bison, of course, were ranging back and forth. Some of their major migrations occurred about 150,000 years ago between the East and West. And again, about 40,000 years ago between the East and West also. So lots of mammals going back and forth. There were other animals that were around that time as well, to kind of give you an idea of what kind of land and life people were living in. Steeves talks about looking at oral traditions for clues, and she mentions the thunderbird. Many of you may have heard of the thunderbird, a large bird that comes down from the sky and shoots lightning bolts out of his eyes or her eyes. There's many stories in different native oral traditions about this thunderbird. And she says, I don't know. She says, I'm just speculating here. But there were actually very large birds that lived here. They went extinct about 10,000 years ago and have been here for thousands of years. They're called the teratorns. Birds, they could be have wingspans anywhere from 11 feet to further down in South America, 24 feet. Huge, massive birds. And she was speculating, were these stories perhaps about those birds and people's experiences with those birds. The Anishinaabe up here in the North Country, in the Great Lakes area, have stories of the giant beaver, which of course we know went extinct about 10,000 years ago. The giant beaver, about the height of a man, or about 6 feet tall, in other words. There are stories in the Anishinaabe culture that talk about a giant beaver dam being broken, and that's what created the islands on the St. Mary's River, what we call the St. Mary's River today, coming out of what we call Sault Ste. Marie, what the Anishinaabe call Bawatane, and those islands that are scattered there like Sugar Island come from that story, from the breakage of the giant beaver dam. Stories about how the giant beaver is one that created Lake Superior, many other stories about the giant beaver. When you go to read Talking Rocks, you're going to be reading about a history that is about after the Ice Age, after the glaciers have retreated. But again, that's after the glaciers have retreated and people have returned to this area in the Great Lakes area that was covered in ice. But at that time, 10,000, 15, 20,000 years ago, the southerly part of Turtle Island as well as South America were not covered in ice. And, you know, there were times, like I said, when the Bering Land area itself was not covered in ice, you know, anywhere between 45,000 to over 100,000 years ago. So fluctuations in terms of what land was available for people to live on. There are also ancient observatories scattered all throughout Turtle Island and down in South America. We have the medicine wheel complexes out on the Great Plains from Wyoming up into Saskatchewan and other places that are thousands of years old. We have you know, the geoglyphs down in South America that align with the solstices, equinoxes, that you can only really fully see from air, you know, in the shape of maybe monkeys. A monkey is one of them, and I can't remember what others, but there's all kinds of different shapes. You can look up the Nazca geoglyphs, Nazca geoglyphs, spelled Geoglyphs. Here in the Great Lakes area, they've discovered ancient observatories underneath Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, including in the Straits of Mackinac area. These are circles of stones that seem to be aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. And it's kind of, you know, people might scratch their heads about how to get underwater, but as the glaciers were retreating, that land would not have been covered in water at that time. So they estimate, given that fact, that these observatories were probably about 10,000 years old, plus or minus there. So that idea that the Clovis people were the first people to come here and the Clovis people were the ones who killed off all the large animals, there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't hold water. Namely being that there are so many sites here that go far beyond 12,000 years ago, and that's become more and more accepted. It's pretty commonly accepted in archaeology now, 15,000 years ago, but there are so many sites that go beyond even 20,000 years, and some very old sites that some prominent archaeologists have said, yeah, this looks like a legitimate site. One site I'm thinking in particular was in California, and Louis Leakey was one of those prominent archaeologists or anthropologists who said, yeah, this 200,000 years old site is legit. So time will tell. So Native peoples have been here for a very long time, and that's really what I'd love people to recognize is a deep history that archaeology is helping us place together. But as Earthwalks will say in Talking Rocks, one of the most important places to go to find out what this history is the people themselves who carry this history in their stories, and to learn those stories and to kind of start piecing together what we can learn, what we know, so we can find out about ourselves as Indigenous peoples, and so we can find out as people who are from the Settler Society, you know, what is this deep history, this deep Native history that's in this land, because that is something that cannot be forgotten. And when we talk about Native American experience, that experience didn't occur just in the last 500 years. It's been ongoing for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. Well, that's a brief overview of what I wanted to share with you. So I hope to hear your thoughts on it. All right, Mama P. See you later.